Well, I guess from their point of view,
for Hispanic Affairs, which organized this event. Thank you. On behalf of all our members, welcome. I would just like to say a few words of thanks before we begin tonight's event. First of all, to the Harvard Organization of Latin America for helping with the organization of this event, to the International Relations Council, to the Undergraduate Council, and of course to the Student Advisory Committee at the Institute of Politics for providing their financial support, without which this event would not have been possible. And there will be a reception afterwards, not in the penthouse, but in the Tubman Rotunda right here in the Institute of Politics. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel.
Thank you. You should have waited till afterwards, but we'll see how the after applause compares with the right. My name is Philip Brenner. I'm a professor of international relations at American University in Washington, D.C., and I'm chair of the Department of International Politics and Foreign Policy in the School of International Service. I have been studying Cuba close to 30 years now, and have written books and articles about Cuba and about U.S. foreign policy. We're going to have, the four of us actually will be speaking tonight, and I'll be playing the role of both moderator and immoderator when my turn comes to speak. We'll hear first from Dr. Richard Nuccio. Dr. Nuccio is the Senior Policy Advisor to the Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, Alec Watson. Dr. Nuccio previously served as a staff consultant with the Western Hemispheric Affairs Subcommittee in the U.S. House of Representatives. And prior to joining this subcommittee, he was the senior associate at the Inter-American Dialogue, which is a project of the Aspen Institute, and director of international programs and Latin American Caribbean programs at the Roosevelt Center for American Policy Studies. Dr. Nuccio is the author of What's Wrong, Who's Right in Central America, and he has a PhD from the University of Massachusetts and an MA from Stanford University. Our second speaker will be Francisco Hernandez. Dr. Hernandez is the president of the famous Cuban-American National Foundation, and he was a founding member of the board of directors of the foundation. He was born and raised in Cuba and studied engineering at the University of Havana until 1960, when he went into political exile. He was then a member of Brigade 2506 at the Bay of Pigs, and he spent 2 years in prison as a result of that in Cuba. He returned to the United States in 1963 and was commissioned as second lieutenant in the Marines, and retired from the military in 1972 as a captain. Dr. Hernandez holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration from the University of Florida and a PhD in Economics from the University of Florida. Our third speaker will be me, and our fourth speaker will be Dr. Susan Eckstein. Several of you, I gather, know Professor Eckstein. She's local talent. She is a professor of sociology at Boston University, where she has been since 1970. She has also taught at Harvard, at Columbia, and the University of California at Santa Barbara. She has held several research appointments at prestigious institutes at Harvard, at Radcliffe, at Fletcher, and she is the author of a book that's essentially in press, a book about Cuba called Back from the Future. that will be published this year. She has her doctorate from Columbia University. Dr. Nuccio.
Thanks. Thank all of you for coming out on a colder night than it was in Washington when we left, and to the organizers of this meeting for inviting us here tonight. I'll try to talk louder. How's that? Okay. What I'd like to do is lay out as briefly as I can, since we're getting late, some of the broad outlines of the Clinton administration policy towards Cuba. I want to emphasize some things that I find when I talk about Clinton administration policy are not as well known as other parts of the policy, and then obviously hope that there's time to respond to any questions that you have. President Clinton has said many times that we have a policy towards Cuba that emphasizes two broad themes. First, to maintain and enforce our economic embargo against Cuba until there is democratic reform and respect for human rights on the island. And second, to recognize that the collapse of Cuba's external support from the Soviet bloc and the unwillingness of Cuba's leaders to face the new realities that that collapse of that support means are inflicting ever greater levels of suffering on the Cuban people. To respond to that suffering, the U.S. government is emphasizing humanitarian assistance through non-governmental channels and seeking to open up new lines of communication with the Cuban people. I'd like to eventually comment briefly about each of these fundamental pillars of U.S. policy towards Cuba. But first I want to remind you about the economic crisis that is gripping Cuba now. Nearly $6 billion in Soviet aid, upon which Cuba relied for most of the last 30 years, has ended. The result has been a virtual collapse of the Cuban economy. Foreign trade has fallen by some 75%, factories are closing, and underemployment may be somewhere around 40%, and new dismissals of state employees are expected to increase this figure even more. The sugar harvest in 1992 was the lowest in 30 years, and 1993 sugar harvest is expected to be even worse. Rationing, which has been a feature of Cuban life for most of the revolution, is growing ever tighter. Milk is now only available for children under the age of 7, and Cubans are authorized one shirt, one pair of shoes, one pair of pants, or a skirt per year. This distressing news is not the result of U.S. policy. It's the result of Cuban policies. The policies of a command economy that has produced shortages and rationing everywhere it has been tried, whether that is in Europe or the Soviet Union or Africa or in the Caribbean. Faced with this accelerating collapse that I've just touched the surface of in these brief comments, Cuba has made some very grudging concessions to reality, but those concessions have so far been too little and too late. And the single dominant feature of each one of the fitful reforms of the regime has been to insist on the maintenance of government control over every aspect of the Cuban people's lives. Individual private enterprise, which was abolished in 1968, is again permissible, but permissible only if an individual falls into one of 130 specific categories, registers with and is approved by the state to engage in that private enterprise. What private entrepreneurs exist cannot be university graduates, nor can they hire anyone to work with them, nor can they form a company to carry on business. In the face of widespread shortages, due in part to the failures of a bureaucratic distribution system, farmers still cannot sell their produce to city dwellers who would be eager to have it. Again and again, Cuba has reiterated its opposition, official opposition, to individual property rights, to private enterprise for Cubans, or to payment of compensation to those whose properties were seized at the time of the Cuban Revolution. While all of this economic distress is going on in Cuba, Cuba still maintains an enormous and costly military and security apparatus. Its armed forces are still the third largest in Latin America, just after Brazil and Mexico, countries with multiple times the population of Cuba. These forces are a drain on the Cuban economy, but they mostly manifest the regime's determination to maintain absolute political control. What modest and grudging economic change there has been and I've described how grudging and modest it is, has been accompanied over the last 2 years by heightened political repression and by the denial of the most basic human rights and democratic practices to the Cuban people. Cuba's communist system is, in short, at a dead end, un callejón sin salida. Those of us who desire peaceful democratic change in Cuba, and I think all of us on this panel do that, can take no pleasure or satisfaction in these grim statistics that I've gone through. Cuba today is a tragedy, and the goal of the United States government is to end that tragedy as soon as possible by offering the hope and example to the Cuban people of what an alternative future for Cuba could be. That is why we are reaching out actively to the Cuban people with humanitarian assistance, a new policy on telecommunications, and increased flows of people and ideas to the island. At the same time, the U.S. government will continue to diplomatically, politically, and economically isolate the Cuban government as a form of pressure on that government to begin to meet the economic and political needs of its own people. This is the two-track policy of the Cuban Democracy Act, which was passed last year by Congress and which President Clinton endorsed when he was still a presidential candidate. He still continues to personally support that bill, law, as offering the best hope for a peaceful democratic transition in Cuba. As I mentioned, experience has taught me that the general public and even experts on Cuba are much more familiar with the economic embargo than they are with the other track of U.S. policy to increase communications with the Cuban people. So I'd like to touch on both aspects of the policy in the couple of minutes that remain. The economic embargo is designed to restrict hard currency to the Cuban regime. It therefore limits a wide range of U.S. corporate and individual interchange with Cuba. The U.S. government also conditions aspects of our relations with other countries on their policies towards Cuba. In part because in passing the Cuban Democracy Act, Congress made clear that it wished to suspend U.S. foreign assistance to any country that was in turn providing assistance to Cuba. This on the rather simple-minded principle that if the American people wished to provide foreign assistance to Cuba, we could do so far more efficiently from Washington than by sending money to Moscow or some other capital. We continue to monitor the economic relationship between Russia, other former Soviet republics, and other countries that are engaged in commerce with Cuba to ensure, and that receive foreign assistance from the United States, to ensure that the relationship with Cuba remains on strictly commercial terms. We have also made it clear to Russia's and to other nations' most senior officials that there will be serious consequences for our aid relationships with them if the relationship with Cuba is other than on market terms. Since the passage of the Cuban Democracy Act, the Treasury Department has ceased licensing trade with Cuba by foreign subsidiaries of U.S. firms. This subsidiary trade, as reflected by the licenses issued, we don't know exactly what the real volume is, but as reflected in the licenses, has fallen from over $700 million in 1990 to less than $2 million today, and it's going towards zero. Similarly, also in compliance with the Cuban Democracy Act, Treasury and Customs have issued notices to all U.S. port authorities, and it's our belief that U.S. ports are no longer used to load or offload Cuban cargo or cargo bound for Cuba, making it more difficult and more expensive for Cuba's external trade. We also continue to monitor travel to Cuba by U.S. citizens. Such travel is licensed routinely for legitimate official, academic, family, or humanitarian activities. And under these provisions, over 15,000 U.S. citizens and residents traveled legally to Cuba last year. Let me turn to the other aspects of the Clinton administration's policy, the aspect designed to reach out to the Cuban people. Earlier this year, the administration issued new regulations authorizing U.S. telecommunications companies to negotiate directly with Cuba for improved telephone service. And there are a number of companies that have taken out licenses and are actively engaged in negotiations with Cuba. I'm very hopeful that they will result in improved telecommunications to Cuba soon. This will be important to reunite families which have been separated by the difficulty of communication with Cuba. But it will also greatly increase fax, modem, and other electronic communication between Cuba and the outside world. These new regulations do not unblock previously frozen funds that were paid into accounts from past telecommunications activities with Cuba, but they would authorize the payment to Cuba of future fees if the Cuban government reaches an agreement with the U.S. companies. Humanitarian donations to Cuba have increased dramatically since the passage of the Cuban Democracy Act a year ago last October. And the Clinton administration is actively engaged in seeking ways to encourage and increase these efforts by non-governmental organizations. Here in Boston, for example, the Catholic Archdiocese of Boston has made very large shipments to Cuba under the provisions of the Cuban Democracy Act. And this upswing in humanitarian assistance is having important positive effects inside Cuba. To give one example, Caritas, which is the Catholic Church's charitable arm inside Cuba, Caritas is expanding its activities, opening new regional centers throughout Cuba to deal with both the distress in Cuba, but also the new volume of humanitarian goods flowing to it. In these NGOs, Cubans are learning how to organize and cooperate for themselves outside of government control. In Washington, we try to monitor these humanitarian shipments carefully to ensure that they go to legitimate non-governmental organizations in Cuba and that the goods, food, and medicine that are delivered are for the direct use and benefit of the Cuban people. Because humanitarian shipments can be made legally to Cuba and are indeed encouraged by the Clinton administration, this administration has also actively opposed politically motivated efforts to violate the U.S. embargo with activities that would in fact be legal and licensable if a license were requested. There are other kinds of things that are going on. The National Endowment for Democracy now has a $500,000 program, again working with non-governmental organizations inside Cuba, focused on policies and programs to encourage nonviolent democratic change. I want to mention also that just as the Clinton administration believes it's important to work with all groups dedicated to peaceful democratic change in Cuba, the Clinton administration has also made it a policy to speak with all groups concerned about Cuba, outside of Cuba, which have a peaceful, legal, and democratic agenda. For that reason, we have accepted invitations to speak to groups such as the Cuban American National Foundation, which Dr. Hernandez of which she's the president, which vigilantly supports a strong U.S. economic embargo of Cuba. And we've also agreed to appear with the Cuban Committee for Democracy, which happens to oppose the U.S. embargo. The administration has taken the position that we will not lend legitimacy to one kind of group, a group that advocates violent or illegal action against Cuba. Short of that, we're pleased and eager to talk with everyone that has an interest and a view to express on Cuba. Consistent with this approach of working for peaceful change, the Clinton administration earlier this year reiterated its determination to enforce the Neutrality Act, which prohibits the organizing of armed activities against other countries from U.S. territory. We have also emphasized what was the clear policy of the Bush administration as well, that the United States has no hostile or aggressive intention towards Cuba, and that we do not seek to impose any group on Cuba or to order Cuba's internal affairs. And consistent with the Cuban Democracy Act, and I'm ending, this administration will continue to proactively seek ways to make contact with the Cuban people, to lessen the political and economic burdens placed upon them by a failed system, and to dispel a myth perpetuated by the Cuban regime that the U.S. desires anything for Cuba other than the right of the Cuban people to choose freely their form of government and their leadership. This administration hopes that this desire for Cuba will be fulfilled soon in Cuba, and we are preparing actively to support the Cuban people in their efforts. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nuccio. That was a bigger applause than we got before. That was good. Dr. Hernandez.
Yes, and thank you very much for having me here. It's a great opportunity coming from Miami to give you perhaps a different outlook about the realities that we Cubans, both in the island and in exile, are living, and we have been living for 35 years now. Unfortunately, this reality, as far as we are concerned, has been greatly distorted. It was 33 years ago, and probably most of you were not alive then, not born. When I went to Huampaní in Peru as a delegate, Cuban delegate to the World Youth Congress. This was a socialist organization, very famous and very well, very popular during the Cold War. And I had been sent there by the other two delegates to that Congress from Cuba were the president of the school, the student union of the School of Engineering of the University of Havana. I was a secretary, and he was the president, Pedro Luis Boitel. He could not go because about a week before he could leave the island, he was arrested and put to jail, sentenced to 30 years in prison, and he died in prison during a hunger strike. The other member of the delegation was Porfirio Ramirez, who was the president of the university, the student union of the University of Las Villas in central Cuba, and he was shot to death. This is in 1960. We all had fought against Batista. Actually, Pedro Luis Boitel had been the coordinator of the student national student coordinator for the 26th of July movement, which of course maybe some of you know that this was the original movement created by Fidel Castro after the attack to the Moncada barracks. I went there to Peru to address these young, mostly socialist students and activists, to tell them exactly what was going on in Cuba. And 30 years ago, it was necessary to send a message that those who had fought 2 years before for Cuban freedom were again in the streets of Havana and in the hills of Santiago and all over the island fighting for our freedom, because we all consider that this revolution and whatever we had fought for had been betrayed. Before I ended the sentence, the young socialists started to leave the room. By the end, it was almost empty. Later, I had to be escorted by the Peruvian police away from the building. In those days, socialists did not listen to reality. I wonder if they still do. Most everyone wanted to believe the stories of Herbert Matthews in the New York Times. They were too beautiful not to be true. A Don Quixote and a Robin Hood born in the little island of Cuba. A single man brave enough to fearlessly challenge the demons of Yankee imperialism. The thousands summarily shot to death. The thousands arrested without charge. The destruction of all the social, religious, and political institutions of Cuba. The confiscations. They all were dismissed as a necessary prelude to democracy, to social equality, and respect for the dignity and the rights of the people. After 33 years and day before yesterday, the Cuban American National Foundation called a press conference in Miami to interview the survivors of the Reyes family, a family of 13, 7 adults and 6 children who left from Sagua de Tanamo, not far from where Castro was born, on a small boat. After 14 days at sea, they were picked up by a Bahamian fishing boat. A man, 48 years of age, died at sea. A boy, 1 year old, arrived dead at Miami Children's Hospital. The mother of the boy and a 6-year-old girl are still in critical condition at the Pan American Hospital in Miami. Their story is a vivid example of the reality that is Cuba today, a reality that has been there for all to see since the early days of the revolution, but that most of us have preferred to distort or simply to ignore. The Reyes family was a large Cuban family of long-experienced fishermen living by the sea, away from the urban conflicts, oblivious to ideology, making a living of a small boat and years of experience catching fish. It could have been the family of the old fisherman immortalized by Ernest Hemingway, though instead of an old man, the head of the Reyes clan was an old woman who had raised 17 children. Her life and that of her family had passed peacefully, monotonous as the sea they knew so well, until one of her children was arrested for criticizing the government at the town square. He was accused of heading a counter-revolutionary group allegedly organized and financed by the CIA. Of course, no one in the family knew what the CIA was, and the CIA probably doesn't know where Sagua de Tanamo is. After a quick trial at which no family member was allowed to attend, the young man was condemned to 12 years in prison. Still worse, their small boat was confiscated and the whole family forbidden from fishing. In the workers' paradise, counter-revolutionaries may not benefit from the natural resources of the nation. The old matriarch made the decision to fight back. She instructed his sons to steal their boat back from the government and sail to Great Inagua, a Bahamian island only 35 miles away. They would have made it in 8 hours, but the old mother had not blown an oil hose, and a storm had not driven them far away from their course. Yesterday, the weekly magazine Trabajadores, published in Havana by the Cuban government, blamed the U.S. embargo and the immigration policies of the United States for the tragedy of the Reyes family. Tomorrow, perhaps dozens of newspapers here and throughout Latin America will side with the Cuban government. Uncounted academicians, intellectuals, and all fellow travelers will clearly understand the fairness of the government argument. To this day, many of us still prefer to walk away from the reality of the Reyes family, much as many walked away from that room in Peru 33 years ago. What is it so? Why is it that after 35 years of injustice, repression, and destruction, some of us still cling to the idea that there is some good that must be preserved from this whole experience? What seed from the fruits of tyranny deserves to be preserved by free people? What can the future generations of Cubans find of benefit in a system of government that inhibits production to the extent that the people cannot be fed or clothed? A government that must use 25% of the global social product to protect itself from its own people. These are not rhetorical questions. They are not, because despite the existence of thousands and thousands of families such as the Reyes family, there are those of us who still want to frame the discussion in terms of the life expectancy of Fidel Castro and the possible survival of this regime. Of course, most do not dare to express it quite that way. It is rather expressed in terms of the need to secure a peaceful transition, the need to avoid at all costs the Cuban Holocaust. I wonder what politically correct term these people may use for the estimated 10,000 Cubans who drowned this year alone in the Strait of Florida trying to escape from Castro's attempt at peaceful transition. For 35 years now, so-called Cubanologists have been giving us their own vision of the Cuban reality. For the most part, they coincide in the rather surprising assertion that the Cuban experience and Castro himself would have turned for the better if only the United States would have left him alone. If it were not for the embargo, the argument follows, Castro would not have an excuse to maintain a totalitarian regime. I wonder again if these pundits of the Cuban experience have bothered to apply the same reasoning to Adolf Hitler or to Saddam Hussein. The embargo, to start with, is a misnomer, a well-crafted product of the ample stock of socialist propaganda tools. In effect, what the United States has exercised during the last 3 decades, and more specifically during the last year since the enactment of the Cuban Democracy Act, is a unilateral restraint from trading with the Cuban government, a measure which is now effective for the first time, only because the Cuban government must now rely on a totally new set of trading partners. It is true that the standard of living of the Cuban people have been reduced as a result of the downfall of Castro's purchasing power. But consider what would he do with any extra funds generated by the lifting of the embargo? Would he use it in improving the lot of the Cuban people, or to improve the efficiency and secure the loyalty of the armed forces and his security apparatus? The other question that seems to consume the interest and imagination of most Cubanologists is whether both the United States and the exiled Cubans should engage Castro in a process of so-called constructive dialogue. Here, we should invoke Socrates and ask for the definition of the terms. Unfortunately, those who constantly call for a dialogue with Castro have thus far been unable to define what they mean, much less explain the process, the objectives, and perhaps more significant, the means by which they will bring Castro to the table and force him to accept their terms. When told of Savonarola's burning at the stake, Machiavelli is said to have said, "Unarmed prophets never succeed." Their option, if they want to succeed, is obviously to arm themselves or disarm Castro. Since armed struggles are not fashionable these days, they must disarm Castro. This is exactly what the embargo and renewed diplomatic pressures are doing. Today, as we look into the final chapter of this terrible experience of the Cuban people, we must set aside the aberrations of the distant vision of intellectuals and academicians looking down from their marble towers and listen to the simple, though infinitely profound conclusion of the old matriarch of the Reyes clan. When asked by a reporter whether the loss of 2 of her children had been too high a price to pay for freedom, she replied, "I'd rather lose 2 to the sea than all of them to Castro." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hernandez. I'm going to now take on the role of immoderator and take off my hat as moderator. I'm going to ask Dr. Nuccio to be my...
What do we do, 15 minutes?
15 minutes, right.
Okay. I'll be very strict.
You'd be as strict as I was. Good. You know, this has been an extraordinary year. The Israelis and the PLO can sign a peace accord. It's not quite in effect. It was supposed to go into effect yesterday, but this is still an extraordinary year for that to happen. The ANC in South Africa can agree to form a new government. These are the kinds of hostilities that have been entrenched over many years, where much bloodshed has been lost, and much blood has been lost, and yet here we are in a debate about Cuba and U.S. policy towards Cuba that in many ways seems like a debate we've been having for 30 years as people still wait for Fidel Castro to go away, to somehow change U.S. policy when Fidel Castro leaves. And it's quite extraordinary that U.S. policy seems to be guided by, well, the interests really of a small group rather than the interests of the United States. I would think that it would be much easier for the United States to overcome the difficulties of having a normal relationship, much easier than it was for the PLO and the Israelis, and much easier than for the ANC and the South African government. And I want to point now to what those U.S. interests are, because I think it is striking how U.S. interests are not being served by U.S. policy, and only the interests of a very small group are. Let me list for you 7 interests that the United States has, I think, with respect to both Cuba and the embargo against Cuba. The first interest we have is keeping the Soviet Union out of the hemisphere and stopping the export of revolution. Oh, wait a second, that really couldn't be an interest. It's been an interest we had for a long time. This was the principal guide to U.S. policy for 30 years. But the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. It's not in Cuba anymore. And Cuba has renounced the export of revolution. But we still might as well keep that as a policy goal, since the policy hasn't changed. The old rationale for the policy no longer exists, but the policy continues. In some sense, you could ask whether the embargo, in fact, even helped our goals of keeping the Soviets out and stopping the export of Cuban revolution. And while there is some debate on it, I think the balance of the debate suggests that the embargo contributed to the Cuban reliance on the Soviet Union and prevented Cuba from, in fact, coming closer to the West. A second interest we have is the development of a world order based on law. I think that this is probably a new interest, although it's an interest articulated by Woodrow Wilson, an idealist notion of what the world could be about, but this seems to be perhaps the first time that we'll be able to do something like that. Well, that vision of a world based on law is not really very much part of U.S. policy towards Cuba. Even today, defining Cuba as an enemy encourages the United States to act in lawless ways. A few years ago, when we thought that the Cubans were sending drugs through Mexico, we boarded a Cuban ship on the high seas. We felt that we could do this because Cuba's an enemy. We don't do that to other countries. The freedom of the seas is something we think is very important for our own ships. And yet, we became the policemen of the Caribbean in order to stop the Cubans, and we feel we can do this because they're our enemy. There's the extraterritoriality of the Cuban Democracy Act. And this undermines an international legal framework that's very much in our interest, because we don't want other countries infringing on our sovereignty, and they don't want us to infringe on their sovereignty. Radio broadcasts and television broadcasts to Cuba, well, technically they're legal, but they are on what Sam Ervin said 20 years ago about the Watergate. Some of the activities were on the windy side of the law. They were technically legal, but not in the spirit of it. Now, speaking of Watergate, let me point to a third interest we have, and that is controlling terrorism. It's interesting that the Watergate burglars were all comrades of Dr. Hernandez at the Bay of Pigs. Indeed, what the United States did in training a group of international terrorists was to make them uncontrollable. Even President Kennedy acknowledged that. When asked about why he would even let the Bay of Pigs go forward, he said, we'll have a disposal problem. Namely, what are we going to do with these trained killers? Well, that is a problem for us. And indeed, though I applaud the Clinton administration for not openly meeting with Alpha 66 after they announced that they would terrorize tourists who go to Cuba, the policy of having Cuba as an enemy simply encourages terrorism. And until the United States actively closes down training bases and doesn't announce that Cuba is an enemy, only until then will terrorism stop. The fourth interest the United States has is controlling drugs. Well, Cuba was a place where drugs flowed freely, I think until 1989. There was a lot of corruption there. But since 1989, since the Ochoa trial, the Coast Guard reports that Cuba, in fact, is the best country in the entire region for helping the United States Coast Guard track down and chase drug dealers. Wouldn't it be better if we could talk more with Cuba and help us to control the flow of drugs through the Caribbean? A fifth interest we have is stabilizing the Caribbean. Now, that's an interest that we can pursue by helping for the development of the Caribbean. And Caribbean leaders are very concerned about their development, particularly since NAFTA has passed. One of the ways they've reacted to NAFTA passing is by embracing Cuba. Cuba is the largest country in the Caribbean, and they recognize that their own development very much depends on their ability to work well with Cuba. They want Cuba integrated into the hemisphere. In fact, yesterday, they signed an accord. The English-speaking Caribbean countries and Cuba signed an accord to have an integrating mechanism. Cuba is already part of the Caribbean Tourist Organization. The sixth concern is related, and that's our concern about hemispheric integration. This is certainly a goal of the administration, and I think in stating this, the administration is representing what is generally perceived as the interests of the United States. But the embargo stands in the way of that, because most of the countries in the hemisphere have a relationship with Cuba. The embargo hasn't isolated Cuba. The embargo, in some sense, has isolated us. Other countries are dealing with Cuba, and to the extent that we want these other countries to become part of a pact with us, Cuba becomes an irritant. It even became an irritant in the NAFTA debate. But it's not just an irritant. There are countries in the hemisphere that have difficulty signing an agreement with the United States as the United States continues to appear to be the hovering giant. The United States of old, the imperial United States, and within their own countries, for the politics of their own countries, they can't condone the way the United States supports the repression against Cuba. In this regard, the Cuban Democracy Act also undermines the possibilities of hemispheric integration as it creates another irritant with allies in the hemisphere who do trade with Cuba. Now, let me note something about the Cuban Democracy Act. It's not just a problem for the hemisphere. The Cuban Democracy Act is a problem for the United States assuming the role of being an international leader. When the United Nations now has voted twice to condemn the United States embargo against Cuba, you have to say, Rick, that we're not marching to the same drum that the rest of the world is marching to. This is not leadership. This is going off in a maniacal way. Do I have 5 minutes?
That's what you get for mentioning.
That's what I get for mentioning her. Well, I mean, in that vote, we had Paraguay and Albania following our lead. A seventh interest is human rights. Now, this is purportedly what the Cuban Democracy Act was passed to promote, human rights. Human rights has had an interesting history. In the 40 years after World War II, human rights was not a primary U.S. concern. Although we gave lip service to the notion of democracy, you're all well enough versed in U.S. history to know that that was not what prompted U.S. policy. Our concern with containment in the Soviet Union is what prompted U.S. policy. But more simply put, what we were concerned about was not how a country organized itself internally. We were concerned about how a country related to us in its external behavior. This was true even during the Carter administration, when we applied different standards to, say, Guatemala and Argentina, where we were concerned about human rights violations, and Iran and the Philippines, which had human rights violations which were as bad. And yet national security took precedence there. Were we to develop a list of violators today, would Cuba be at the top of that list? Would it rank ahead of China, where there is torture and the use of prison labor? Would it rank ahead of El Salvador and Guatemala? Would it rank ahead of Saudi Arabia in the way in which it suppresses free speech when you get your hands cut off for disagreeing with the government, or Kuwait, which represses its women. No, I think Cuba would not be at the top of the list. Even the UN rapporteur has said that the problems in Cuba are the problems of its judicial system, not the problems of disappearances and torture. There may have been problems, and I will acknowledge there were problems in the 60s and even into the 70s, though they don't exist today. Is Cuba great? No, it's not. Cuba's not great. But neither are many of the countries that we deal with. Many of our allies are, in many ways, worse than Cuba. Indeed, many of those allies would wish that they could provide the one pair of shoes for their children, the milk for every kid under the age of 7. Indeed, it's safe to say that what Castro would do with that extra money, if he got it, he would probably go back to what he was doing in providing every kid under the age of 12 with milk that they can't provide now. Consistency is quite important in U.S. foreign policy in pursuing our interests and pursuing it in terms of human rights standards. And indeed, it's not clear that our policy has been consistent in this regard. Even if we were to focus on Cuba, though, let me conclude by saying that it's not clear that the embargo would be the best way to achieve human rights in Cuba. For one thing, the embargo justifies the increase of repression there. I mean, it's understandable that the Cubans think that, in fact, our intention is to overthrow that government. That was the purpose of the embargo originally, and it's not clear, despite the words of the administration, that's not the purpose of the embargo today. Indeed, activists in Cuba oppose the embargo. It's hard to ignore the people in Cuba who are saying, don't have the embargo. I mean, the ANC wanted us to have an embargo against South Africa. The Cuban human rights community does not want us to have an embargo against Cuba. Why aren't we listening to them? Indeed, the question ultimately is, should the United States be involved in the business of subversion? Because that's what the embargo is about. It is about trying to change the government of Cuba and overthrow it. A much better way to deal with Cuba would be by reaching out to Cuba, negotiating with Cuba, rather than trying to overthrow it. Susan Eckstein.
One of the, can you hear? Okay. One of the advantages of coming late, I guess, is that you're put in the position of reacting to other people. One of the disadvantages is that sometimes some people say things that you actually agree with ahead of time, and you don't know whether you should just not mention them or reinforce them. Let me begin by saying I'm one of those terrible Cubanologists that are supposed to be suspect. I have spent about maybe 17 years working on and off on Cuba. I've done other research in between. While I have, at some level, respect for Mr. Hernandez and how he's committed his life to his personal beliefs, I would like the respect returned to me for my efforts and my fellow, quote, Cubanologists' efforts to try to understand what's going on, what is good, what is bad, but to also recognize what is good and in some transition would be nice to see preserved. Strikingly, no one has mentioned the social developments in Cuba under Castro. If I had an overhead projector here, I would show you some data that most of the critics, at least within academic circles, are willing to concede. It's not what they want, it's not the government that they want, but they generally will concede on the social developments that no one has really mentioned today. Cuba ranks second in Latin America in the number of doctors per population, first in the number of nurses per population, per capita. Cuba ranks third in the number of hospital beds per population. It ranks highest in life expectancy. Strange as it may seem, men in Cuba have a higher life expectancy than men in Washington, D.C. Infant mortality. Cuba ranks first in Latin America. Infant mortality is 3 times higher in Washington, D.C. than in Havana. Now, another thing, actually, this is a striking statistic. One of the problems said to be holding third world countries back is the high fertility rates. Cuba, despite the Reyes family having 17 children, they are a phenomenon to be studied, not because of their politics and how they've given their life, but you know, Cuba is no longer reproducing its population. The average fertility rate is now under 2, which is what is needed to reproduce the population. So I say this not to say that there aren't problems with the government or problems with the country, but I do think that these things should be out there in any honest discussion of what's going on. It's also important to me because there is going to be some kind of transition in Cuba. And it seems to me what is absolutely vital is that efforts are made to preserve the gains of the revolution at the same time as the problems of the revolution are addressed. That's the first thing I want to make. The second point I wanted to discuss is what is going on economically. True, things are bad, and there aren't real signs of things improving very much that I can find. And when I've been on trips to Cuba, it seems like each year everybody says that since 1989, says that things have deteriorated. So I want not to be misinterpreted on those grounds. I don't see ending the embargo in and of itself as resolving the problems of Cuba, though they certainly would help. I say this because Cuba is a trade-dependent economy, as any island in the Caribbean is, and to have as much of the trade cut off as our representative from the State Department has admitted, I quote his own figures, trade has fallen by 75% since 1989. That's devastating for any trade-dependent economy. Well, the image that's given is that the problems were all Cuba's, and as soon as Cuba was isolated from the Soviet Union, the problems surfaced, although probably if he gave you a historical analysis, he would say the problems were there before 1989. I don't think he was trying to say it all happened since. But the problem is, there's no question it was tied to the Soviet Union. But if any country in Latin America, and particularly the trade-dependent economies in the Caribbean, lost that much of their trade, not to say aid, they would be in very bad situation as well. That's no solution to the problem, but it says that you need trade. I mean, if you have an industry and one item that you need to import, as all countries that have gone through import substitution need to import, one item need not be there, and there goes, you have to stop production. So the problems are much greater in some sense than the 75% collapse of trade, I would say. But what I would like to suggest is that it isn't just, grudging concessions too little, too late. There may be concessions, but in some sense, the idealism that motivated, to a certain extent, the revolution, there have been concessions, grudging concessions all along. And what I would like to really point out is the way in which Cuba has opened up to market forces. And as it was reported in the Wall Street Journal about 2 weeks ago, that it's irreversible opening up to market forces. I think it's important to understand that. And also to understand that there's actually history to this. Beginning in 1977, Cuba made its first efforts to attract foreign investment. But let me just, this is Western capital. In 1974, 41% of Cuba's trade was with the West. Now, the collapse of the movement from 59% of the trade being with the Soviet bloc to about 86% in 1989 was not Cuba's own doing. Castro seized the opportunity in the mid-70s to trade with the West and lost that opportunity as the world market price of sugar collapsed beginning in the latter 70s. Now, under the current period, let me just highlight the fact that Cuba is encouraging foreign investments right and left. The kinds of terms that are given to foreign investors are tax concessions, profit repatriation rights, exemptions from the labor laws, managerial rights to fire workers, majority ownership, and actually all sectors of the economy are now open to foreign investment. Now, admittedly, this is not the ideal that they want, but the point is it's the reality that the Cuban government recognizes. The dollar has been made a legal currency in Cuba. Again, this is grudgingly. I mean, no country wants a foreign currency to be the legalized currency of their own. But the point is that the Cubans are trying to come to terms with the New World Order or the New World Disorder. And I think it's important to recognize that they have that flexibility to them. I also want to talk about the issue of rationing. The Cuban government doesn't want rationing. This is, if you want, a socialist concession, a grudging socialist concession. Rationing had been in the process of being diminished. In the course of the 70s, it had been declining, the percentage of Cuban income that was spent on rationing. The Cubans have reintroducing it grudgingly because it is their way to deal with the issue of scarcity. This is an economy of scarcity for the reasons we've discussed. Production is down, trade is down. So what do? Do you use the neoliberal formula where you let the market solve everything and some people do well and the poor do not? The cost of living going up to the poor. The Cubans have tried to equalize sacrifice to deal with a terrible situation. But the reasons are out of this commitment to a social project that has not been discussed here today. Now, the rationing isn't working. And it's not working because it is difficult in an economy of scarcity to enforce rationing. The profits are too good to be missed in the eyes of most Cubans. So what you're finding is at every step of the way, people are siphoning off goods to the black market, from the point of production to the point of distribution. And because the price of goods is so much higher in the black market that there's very little available in the ration market. And so this is now causing problems for those people who don't have access to dollars. Because the dollar is so valuable in the black market. The black market price, I've heard people quoting it up to 100 pesos to the dollar. I was there last summer, it was about 60. In 1989, I think the official, well, even the official rate still is something like around a peso to the dollar, although the Cuban government itself now has an unofficial rate of exchange as well. Anyway, I do want to suggest that the Cubans on the economic level are flexible and are trying various kinds of survival strategies, including, I would argue, pre-capitalist strategies of survival, such as using draft animals instead of mechanized equipment in agriculture, a country that had prided itself on its mechanization of agriculture. More and more people are using bicycle as a means of transportation because so little oil is coming into the country. Because of oil, there's very little electricity. People are encouraged to use candlelight, to make their own candles, to make their own clothing. This is not what the Cubans want. It's not what the Cuban government wants. It is economy of survival at this point that they want to change. So this brings me to the final point that I want to address, and that's politics and U.S. policy. I am no defender of the political system. I don't want it for myself. I would not want to be an intellectual in Cuba. So let me say my comments are said with this in mind. But I want to say first that I do think most people aren't intellectuals. Most people are more concerned with their everyday living, which of course has become problematic now too. But I think that that's important to say. I mean, that, first of all, that Castro is no Hitler. Castro is not a Saddam Hussein, neither Hitler, which is not to say that Castro is a Democrat. But he has had a commitment to social issues that these other dictators haven't. Also, I actually don't think that he was as dictatorial, which is not to defend him in his policies. But the problem is, I think that U.S. policy is unfortunately misguided, and I would like to see that that's changed. I think it's misguided. One has to think, if one is one of the only countries in the world to be supporting an embargo, that maybe something is wrong with a policy of embargo. The problem is it doesn't work either, just like rationing doesn't work. Where there's a will, there's a way, where there's money to be made, et cetera, people violate it, and when other countries don't believe in it, they don't support it. So what you're finding is that more and more countries simply are not supporting the U.S. Policy towards Cuba, except the weaker countries in the third world that are economically dependent on the United States, or the Soviet Union that has become more and more dependent on the United States. The Clinton administration has made a condition for Russia selling nickel to the United States that they not sell Cuban nickel to the United States. A condition for aid to the Soviet Union is that they break their ties with Cuba. A condition of Cuba, and the United States also gave money to Cuba, aid to Cuba to buy sugar on the world market, on the proviso that they do not buy their sugar from Cuba. These are ways in which the United States government is helping to create the very conditions that our government is so sympathetic and so preoccupied with, the plight of the people in Cuba. Unfortunately, we're making conditions worse and not better, and I don't think that we are increasing the chances of democracy, which is the other supposed concern of our foreign policy. Why? I think Castro is the best hope for a smooth, peaceful transition, the one thing everybody on this panel agrees on. Why? His opponents are happy to get rid of him. His followers will do what he says. So I think, in fact, that our government is missing an opportunity because things are just going from bad to worse. I think that if Castro isn't there to help facilitate some kind of a transition, that there can be lots of bloodshed. There are arms around Cuba. There are people, despite what we have heard, who are committed to the revolution. Fewer and fewer, but they're there. So if we want a peaceful transition, I think he's our best hope. Democracy cannot be built in thin air. Getting rid of somebody you dislike does not mean democracy is going to arise from the ashes of the old regime. The problem is Cuba has, unfortunately, too little experience with democracy, including in the pre-Castro period. Very little tradition on which to build, which is not to say it shouldn't be tried, but it's not going to just emerge out of the ashes. I think the experience of Ceausescu in Romania is much more symptomatic of what is likely to emerge in Cuba than a Hungary or a Poland. Another problem is that civil society has been smashed in many respects in Cuba, rebuilt under the mass organizations of the Cuban government, but they're becoming increasingly empty shells. So the very vitality, other than political parties, to well-functioning democracies, having organizational life really doesn't exist. Now, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to help bring about a democratic transition. But we can't assume it's around the corner. There are no organized political forces of any significance in Cuba on which democracy can easily build. And this is why I think Castro's comment to Diane Sawyer in her interview with him last March should be taken seriously and explored and seen where it can lead. He said, even long-distance runners get tired of running. I hope this is the last time my people ask me to serve their country. This, I thought, was a message to Washington. And I'm sorry if this opportunity isn't explored to hope that we can bring a democratic transition to Cuba.
Thank you, Dr. Eckstein. I'm going to ask that we can, two things. One, that we're going to extend this session a little beyond the 9:30, since I know there are a lot of questions. I'm going to ask people to ask their questions briefly as opposed to making speeches. And I saw a hand up there in the back. Go to the mics, please. And go to the mics.
Two quick questions to Mr. Nuccio. The first is, if the U.S. government is so concerned about the welfare of the Cuban people, why is it that we refuse to sell food and medicine to Cuba, unlike our policy towards any other country in the world? We do, but on completely different terms than we're willing to sell food or medicine to any other country. And the second question is, if the United States does not threaten Cuba, doesn't have any aggressive intention towards Cuba, why is it that the U.S. refuses to renounce the continuation of large-scale military exercises in the waters and air around Cuba, which the people and the government of Cuba very understandably see as a threat to their survival?
Okay, thank you. You understand the questions?
Yep. Food and medicine are encouraged as donations from non-governmental organizations to non-governmental organizations in Cuba. There is no shortage of food or medicine available to Cuba to buy. The problem, and there are many sources, these are highly fungible commodities. There is very little, if anything, that the United States has that cannot be purchased by Cuba on the open market. The problem with Cuba is not supplies of food and medicine. The problem is the currency to buy it. And that is the basis of the policy. In fact, it is legal to sell medicine to Cuba for specific purposes. And I said this to Cuban officials. If there are medicines or equipment that are not available in Cuba and available nowhere else in the world or not obtainable anywhere else, if they're single source, only available from the United States, there is a licensing procedure available, and the United States would be happy to receive an application from Cuba for such a commodity, precisely to demonstrate that there is no hostility towards the Cuban people. But in fact, Cuba has problems purchasing food and medicine, not because they can't purchase it from us, because they don't have the money to purchase it. Second, on the exercises, Guantanamo is a base that has a long and difficult relationship between the United States and Cuba. It's probably something that will be among the first things to be addressed in any transitional situation in Cuba, and certainly in any future democratic Cuba. There are, in fact, communications between the United States and Cuba at very technical and low levels, precisely to give assurance that any exercises conducted by the United States are not hostile in either intent or design. And I can't say much more about it than that, but I don't think that it is a valid concern.
Okay. May I extend a little bit on this? Let me also say that the reason why there is not more direct donations of food and medicines to Cuba is that Fidel Castro will not allow them to be distributed directly to the people. And something that it's probably not very well known is that the Cuban community in Miami it's sending annually about $300 to $400 million worth of donations directly to their own relatives in Cuba. Unfortunately, this is not really very huge amounts, because Fidel Castro charges $25 per pound for any food that is delivered onto Cuba to the relatives. Now, during the Christmas, there will be probably about 2 to 3 million pounds of different types of food that will go from the Cuban community down to their relatives in Cuba. The problem is that this is extremely expensive, precisely because Fidel Castro is using these, and is using the humanitarian feelings of the Cuban people in exile precisely to make a lot of money out of this. In addition to that, let me also say that recently I met with 2 bishops, Catholic bishops that went back to Cuba. While they were in Miami, we proposed and we presented a proposal whereby if their Caritas or Caritas organization, the Catholic organization for distributing relief, were allowed to provide directly to the people these donations, we will make sure that there would be a substantial mobilization in the exile community to send it directly to the people. The problem is that Castro's response was that 80% had to go, of all these donations, had to go directly to the government, and only 20% to the those selected by who were the people who were donating. And here's where we are. We are prepared to send huge amounts. As a matter of fact, we have already developed a program in which 500,000 packets of 50 pounds each can be delivered to Cuba in about a week, provided the Cuban government allows these to go and distributed by international relief organizations, not by his own henchmen.
Okay, Francisco, let me suggest, I see someone at the microphone there. There may be essentially groups of questions that, so if we can get 3 or 4 questions and then let the panel respond, because there may be some repetitions. Sir.
I just want to ask one quick question and then a follow-up. I want to know what Ms. Eckstein and Mr. Brenner's position is towards American policy towards Haiti in terms of the present economic pressures in the Haitian government for democracy. Ms. Stein, do you support that policy or are you against that policy?
You know, I think I'm going to prefer not to talk. I'm here to talk about Cuba. I'm not an expert on Haiti, so I'll
thank you,
leave that
thank you.
out.
Mr. Brenner,
Privately,
Mr. Brenner.
Well, it isn't relevant except insofar as the, well, what I'll tell you is that President Aristide has called for sanctions. And in Cuba, the Cuban...
Mr. Brenner, you can make it short because I have, there are a lot of people with a lot of questions and I want to go through. Well, the answer, I guess, is I don't hear the answer. I just want a quick answer. She gave me a quick answer. I would appreciate your quick answer as well.
Yes, I support them. I support the sanctions against Haiti.
Then, very quickly, Mr. Hernandez, you should not bother defending the embargo for Cuba when you're in an audience with the preponderance of your panel support embargo for the purpose of democracy. I think intellectual dishonesty brings these kind of answers. And I suggest to you that you should just absolutely accept that we in the United States, and both Cubanologists and American policy experts, support the use of economic pressure to obtain foreign policy objectives. Be that what it may, it just happens that some people use it at some times when it's convenient for them, and then they cannot answer when they are asked a question. Let me just quickly put this to you, and this is to Mr. Nuccio, and this is actually the meat of the question.
Sir, you are monopolizing a lot of time. You promised a quick question and a follow-up.
The question was asked, and if you bear for me, it's for Mr. Nuccio, and it will be my last question. I'll sit down and you can, for the sake of intellectual freedom and freedom of expression, just let me finish the question. Mr. Nuccio,
what about other people's
there are comments right now that Fidel Castro and the Cuban government is proposing to the Clinton administration sort of a trade deal, if you please. One is they would in fact stop trading in drugs and would enforce the policy of restraining drug trade from Cuba if there is a softening of the policy by the Clinton administration leading to recognition and so on. And my question to you, and I really want to make sure that I don't bias it, but I'm forced to.
I can save you. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
There is no such discussion. It doesn't exist.
Sir.
There's a lot of fancy talk about democracy. I personally wish we had a little more meaningful democracy right here in the United States. In terms of democracy, one thing that bothers me is that certain Cuban American groups talk a lot about democracy and freedom in Cuba, and they don't seem to have a lot of respect for it here in the United States. And I would like members of the panel to comment on the behavior of some Cuban American organizations in terms of respecting rather than bullying and intimidating and terrorizing people here in our country. This is my country, and I value democracy here. And I resent people who come here from other countries who preach about democracy in their country of origin and bully people here in our country where we do value democracy and we do value liberty, or at least we say we do, and many of us try to carry that out. And I'd like to piggyback on that, a question to Mr. Nuccio. I think it's really dishonors the Clinton administration and the government of our country to allow our policy in relation to Cuba to be held hostage by these kinds of people who practice these kinds of tactics. And just because the electoral vote of Florida is considered important in a presidential race.
Okay, let's take 2 or 3 questions together.
Yes, my question is to Mr. Hernandez. It's really hard to talk to you because you resemble so much of my father, which is in Cuba now. And me as a Cuban, I have to come to terms with speaking against the embargo. And as I sit on my seat, I see some people here that probably never visit Cuba in their life, never been there. I've been there 15 years of my life, and they don't know what Cuba is like I don't. And you probably don't because you left there 30 years ago and you don't know how it is like because you haven't visited back. And my question is, do you support Commando LS and Alpha 66, your organization does? And also...
No, we don't.
And also, I would like to say that the embargo, I don't support the embargo in Haiti. I don't support the embargo that was against Panama. I don't support the embargo against Iraq. I don't believe that our government has any right to dictate on any government around the world how they should run the government. And that is against our policy as a nation. It's against our constitution. And that's why I'm against the embargo. The embargo has never worked against any nation. It has never worked against Iraq. It has never worked against Russia. Okay, the only thing it has bring suffering to the people. And that's what I'm concerned about. I don't care about Cubanologists, like you call themselves, communist, socialist, democratic. All I care about is the people in Cuba, my family, that are suffering due to people here that don't understand the real situation that is going on in Cuba right now. Okay, people like ourselves, it's real easy for us to say, don't send aid to Cuba because we can go to the supermarket and buy any kind of meat we want, and meanwhile, stop the people in Cuba from being what they want to be, socialist, communist, whatever they want to be, let them be, as long as they can feed themselves, sure, educate themselves, and be by themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. One more question?
Yes, I think it's for Mr. Hernandez. You mentioned that Castro was using humanitarian aid, I believe it was you, for policies to, he was using humanitarian aid in a very cynical and criminal way. And I was struck by the fact that this past summer and last fall, there was an organization called Pastors for Peace that was sending food and humanitarian aid to Cuba and to non-governmental organizations. And at one point, there was a little yellow school bus that was retained or stopped at the border. And the people on that school bus sat there for 23 days on a hunger strike. And the World Council of Churches, and the idea was that this bus couldn't go to Cuba because it was going to be used for troop transport or possibly for torture. And it was supposed to be sent to a church. And the World Council of Churches offered to mediate to see that that bus, went to the I think it was the Ebenezer Baptist Church Youth Council there at the church. And the U.S. didn't even bother to answer. You talk about non-governmental organizations. Also, wait a minute, just another one. In 1976, I think the U.S. government and the Castro government had made an agreement that 20,000 Cubans a year could migrate to the United States if they wanted to. And it was a matter of processing visas and so on. The United States government agreed to do that, but it does not grant visas for Cubans to come here. And it tightens the screws in Cuba so hard, and they come, on the rafts and so on. The situation is very bad there, and we all agree to that.
Is your question, why does the United States government do that?
Why do they do that? And why, if you talk about opening things up and extending the hand to Cuba and in contacts to its people and working with non-governmental organizations, I don't understand why all these bottlenecks and things like that.
Thank you.
Can somebody explain that to me?
It seems there are several questions for you, Dr. Hernandez, and Dr. Nuccio, you could chime in, and then there's one question for the entire panel on. Go.
Okay. First, as far as your question, no, we do not believe that the strategy or the tactics of Commando Celes or Alpha 66 are worth really at this time. First of all, they are not practical. Second, I do not believe that the enemies of the Cuban people is really the enemy of freedom and democracy. And if these people, this is what they are looking for, obviously they are not going to attain it by attacking and probably risking the lives of the people. So, no, we disagree with that. Unfortunately, the problem is that there is a tremendous frustration among some of these people because they are seeing all those who are being put to jail, all those who are being shot continuously, and I disagree with the fact that there is no the Fidel Castro regime in Cuba now. It's better than the one in El Salvador or some of the places that were mentioned here. But as far as the embargo is concerned, I agree with you also. I think that we should be looking at the problems of the Cuban people. We should be looking instead of our personal, and I respect your opinion and I respect all of our opinions here, but the problem is that the Cuban people themselves within the island do not have the opportunity that you have here or your academicians and intellectuals have to express their own opinion, and this is the terrible thing. The other problem is that the situation in Cuba, as well as the situation in Haiti, is not going to be resolved as long as Castro is in power or a general is in power in Haiti, simply because the situation has to be developed through democracy and freedom. And this is what we want. And Castro is not going to give this freedom to the Cuban people. And it's not going to allow them to really earn a living so that they will not come to the United States and take the rights that they have or have the freedom inside the island to determine their own destiny. Your father cannot determine his own destiny while he is in Cuba because everything is determined exactly by the state and by this system within which he lives. Now, what we want to do is bring back to Cuba and to the Cubans the opportunity to decide by themselves. And this is what we are asking,
Dr.
Pastor.
Hernandez, wait. We have some other questions we have to answer. Dr. Nuccio, do you want to speak to the last woman's question?
Sure, I'd like to clarify. I think there are quite a few people here who are from other countries, nationalities from other countries, I think they would be very upset were the United States to automatically grant immigration status to 20,000 Cubans just who showed up at the U.S. interest section and asked for it. The agreement to which the lady referred was an offer to accept up to 20,000 immigration visas, issue up to 20,000 immigration visas, if people met the valid criteria for being a U.S. immigrant, which is that they had close family relatives in the United States who requested that visa status, and they met other criteria that is set down in U.S. law for everyone who wishes to emigrate permanently to the United States.
Why are those people accepted when they come over by a raft, though?
That's because of the so-called Cuban Adjustment Act, which means if you get here by your own power. But the question was about immigration visas. Those people are accepted as refugees, not as immigrants. And there is, in fact, a refugee center in the Cuban interest section that's part of it. But if it's a question about immigration visas, those people who come in and apply for immigration status are reviewed just like anyone else would be in another country from another nationality. They're granted the visa if they meet the criterion for immigration to the United States. And in fact, there's no backlog in that system at all now. All the backlog is cleared.
A question about
Pastors for Peace. I know a lot about the Pastors for Peace. I was very actively involved from the Congress in encouraging the U.S. government to respond positively to the Pastors for Peace. At the initiative of people in the Congress, the Treasury and the Commerce Department sent special agents to the border to review the material that Pastors for Peace wished to donate to Cuba. Pastors for Peace refused to indicate in a written form what it was they were sending to Cuba. That is a requirement that we ask for people to export any volume of things outside the United States, that they tell us what it is they're exporting, let alone to Cuba. By agents going personally and reviewing what was in the possession, in the possession of Pastors for Peace, the vast majority of the material, which would have been legally licensed if a license had been requested, was approved and was sent forward. Some things like computers and some prescription drugs were held back. On the prescription drugs, in part because there is very clear evidence that certain kinds of drugs are used in forms of psychological torture. They're administered to people against their will. People are giving shock treatment without medication and so on. And there is, again, a very strict provision of the law that Congress passed that requires us to be very scrupulous about prescription drugs. And those are the things that were held back. If Pastors for Peace had asked for a license, 95% of what they sent to Cuba and what they are now organizing to send to Cuba would go through. There is no opposition to humanitarian donations to Cuba. Pastors for Peace is not trying to make humanitarian donations. It's trying to create a civil disobedient act against the embargo. That's their right as Americans. But it's our obligation to enforce the law precisely so we can continue to have legal donations to Cuba and that are supportable and sustainable over time.
Susan, would you like to speak to any of these issues?
Sure.
There was the first question also about democracy within the Cuban-American community.
Right. Let me speak to that one first. Just as I talk about, or mention that I worry about the social bases of democracy in Cuba, I worry whether the answer, in all due respect to my person sitting on my right, whether this is to be found in Florida or among the Cuban-American community. Now, I don't mean to say all of the Cuban-American community, but a human rights organization that devotes itself to exploring human rights abuses in the third world thought the problems in Miami or in Florida were sufficiently severe to issue a report on Florida. Unfortunately, I don't feel that the Cuban-American community, partly because of their own political views, is really working as a very democratic force. And I'll give a personal, true story. I had a student who was a sinologist, an expert on China, who wrote a very, very interesting thesis on the elderly in China. And I thought, gee, this would be, and she based a lot of her information, this was before you could get into China at all, on interviewing emigres in Hong Kong and Taiwan. I thought, what an incredible source of information one could use to better understand Cuba, interviewing Cuban Americans about experiences they had in Cuba. So I thought about it seriously as a research strategy, and I approached a very respected Cuban American academic, not a Cubanologist, who feels as a Cuban American actually he shouldn't do research on Cuba. But he said, don't go near them. It's too risky. It may have been an overstatement, but it was a sentiment of how he feels. And this is somebody who is very committed to Cuba, improving relations between the United States and Cuba. So I say this as somebody who's highly respected within political and academic circles. So unfortunately, I think that this is a problem that needs to be worked on in this country too, in terms of the issue of U.S. policy towards Cuba, because the Cuban American community is very interested in the future policy in Cuba. Some of them have an interest in returning to Cuba. Some of them have an interest in going into politics in Cuba. And so I think that is an issue.
Susan,
okay. One quick little point about the issue of the Clinton administration allowing NGOs to bring food in. This is, or medicine, and I think this is commendable, but it's unfortunate that the government is only allowing non-governmental groups to go in, and if they are committed to the issue, that they don't seriously consider whether they shouldn't be engaged in allowing it too.
We've rented this hall only until 10 to 10, so if we can take one more question. The woman in blue, since we want to give people as much more time, much opportunity.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, which hopefully I'll be brief, but given the complexity of the situation. Mr. Nuccio, perhaps you can comment on the fact of the recent vote in the United Nations, once again condemning the United States and once again making the United States the pariah nation. I happened to be in Cuba during the time this vote was taken, and I found the level of intellectual discourse, the level of interest, and the level of open discussion much higher than that I find in the United States. Also, in respect to the United States and its relation with Cuba, I met a great many Cubans of various political persuasions, from militant supporters of the regime to ardent opponents, and none of them welcome a time when the Cuban American Foundation would come back to Cuba and destroy the gains of the revolution.
Your question's about the United Nations vote, though, right?
Well, partially. And one other thing, and that is that I also had the opportunity to go to El Salvador, a nation which Mr. Hernandez calls a democracy, and the union leaders of that group were 6 months later were murdered by death squads supported and maintained by the United States. How many true union leaders in Cuba have been murdered?
Okay. Dr. Nuccio?
Vote this year, and I suspect there'll be another vote next year. I'd also refer you to the vote this month in Geneva, where the highest majority ever agreed with the U.S.-sponsored resolution condemning human rights violations in Cuba. It was endorsed by most of the OECD countries and virtually all of the Latin American countries as well. There are lots of votes that are taken in the United Nations, and I think they're all important and should all be considered seriously.
And do you want to respond to the question about El Salvador? You are a Central American expert as well.
Well, I work a lot on Central America, and I guess, first of all, the United States is working very hard to prevent death squad activity from coming back to El Salvador. El Salvador, if you go back, I think you would find a very different situation from the 5 8 years now, I've been going in and out of El Salvador. There's a very new spirit in El Salvador. Talk to the FMLN people about that new spirit that they're trying and working very hard to preserve and expand, and we're cooperating with them. And as you read in the New York Times today, our ambassador in El Salvador expelled military advisors when he discovered them involved in activities that could possibly have been associated with death squad activities. The second point I want to make is there was a coup in Guatemala last May and June in which an elected president tried to suspend the Constitution with military support. And it was absolutely critical for Guatemalans to have the United States threaten to cut off all GSP privileges, Generalized System of Preferences, trade preferences for Guatemala as part of their effort to restore the Constitution, to put the former head of the Human Rights Office in Guatemala, which is internationally, he gained an international respect for what he did in Guatemala. When I go back to Washington tomorrow, we're going to be meeting with members of Congress to try to persuade them to release a piddly $10 million in economic support to Guatemala and to condition it precisely on human rights, to try to continue to press the Guatemalan government to respect human rights and to continue on a process that is constitutional and legal. So I've been a professional Latin Americanist for 25 years. I am extremely happy at what the United States position is throughout the hemisphere. And it would be inconsistent with everything we are trying to do in Salvador, in Guatemala, in Mexico, in Peru, on the issue of human rights, for us not to have democracy and human rights at the top of our agenda with Cuba, not at the bottom.
I want to thank OLA and the Hispanic Forum for sponsoring this, and thank the panelists.
Why is this country such a big threat